All right, so next up we have Sarah Ann Thompson, coming from the Farallon Institute for Advanced Ecosystem Research.
Thanks for coming. Let's see. I'd like to begin by acknowledging a very talented team of co-authors that mostly put together this project and this presentation, and they come from a variety of different places there. So as much as I love the Pacific Northwest, I'm going to talk about global system. So let's just start with some factoids of general importance, because that's fun. 71% of the Earth is ocean, which you've probably heard before. 92% of all habitats on the planet are marine. So the fifth assessment report of IPCC contained a chapter on oceans for the very first time this year. Coastal upwelling systems are what I'll be talking about today. They account for a very small percentage of the surface area of the global ocean, but they also provide upwards of 20% of wild marine capture fisheries. So these are very productive areas of the ocean. This schematic, actually from the Seattle Times, is a really nice general example of oceanic food web structure. And so at the top is upper trophic level predators that feed on things like small fishes or mid-level fishes. Those fishes in turn feed on things like zooplankton, and zooplankton typically feed on phytoplankton. Phytoplankton, of course, they take up energy from the sun, photosynthesize. And I'll be referring to productivity, which is the conversion of that sun's energy into biotic energy via phytoplankton and then zooplankton. So phytoplankton can be considered primary productivity and zooplankton can be considered secondary productivity. And this is important in regional upwelling. So over here I'm sorry for the fuzziness of this diagram, but it was the best one I had. We've got plankton and larval animals. And what happens in regional upwelling is that the winds blow toward the equator. So on the west coast of North America, they blow from the north, along the shore. And what that does is it pushes the surface water offshore. And when that happens, cold, nutrient-rich water is brought up from depth. And that's what we are referring to as upwelling. So when this happens, this cold and nutrient-rich water is great for phytoplankton and the productivity that happens in the nearshore area. Okay, why do we care? Well, we care because of all that productivity. This generalized diagram illustrates the optimal environmental window hypothesis. This hypothesis says that with increasing upwelling and increasing productivity, that we get this bell-shaped curve. And what that means in terms of upwelling is that when upwelling is low, productivity really could use some more nutrients. So it'd be great if we had more food. And when upwelling is high, there's too much advection. And what that means, I'll go back here, is that if there's too much advection, then this stuff is getting pushed offshore, where it either can't be used or it's not the right habitat and it dies. So, too much upwelling is bad. Not enough upwelling is bad, generally speaking. And the magic happens up in the mid-level. So this is a map of California. This is the Bay Area. And we can show spatial variability in upwelling via temperature. Like I said, the upwelling brings up cold water to the surface. And in this scale, the cold water is the dark colors. And we've got the winds blowing from the north. This could also indicate the California current comes from the north along here. And these really dark areas, you can see several of them, show where there's this regional upwelling coming along. It tends to happen south of the capes and headlands. This really dark one right here, south of Point Arena, is an area of some of the most intense upwelling on the west coast of North America. There's also temporal variability in upwelling, both in terms of throughout the year, as well as within a season. And so what I've got on the top graph is alongshore wind stress. What I'm gonna really focus on today is the winds that are driving upwelling. So we can see the daily average is in the red line, and a smooth line is the blue. The wind measurements happen in an inverted way, so stronger winds are a more negative value. You can see that as we move along through the year, we've got really strong winds from the north happening in the spring and summer, and that there's some variability, you know, from week to week it can be a little bit different. And just to remind you here, we get more upwelling when there's more wind. In temperature, you can see the same type of variation. So the wind and temperature go along, the temperature indicates the upwelling, and again, we've got a good seasonal signal where we get more upwelling in the spring and summer, and then also kind of a bi-weekly sort of signal with the upwelling too. The star indicates Bodega Bay is where these data came from. You can also see this with your very own eyes when you're out on the shore. This is a windy day in May in the California coast, and when you see all of this choppy water, and you know it's windy because your hair is blowing everywhere, you can assume that upwelling is happening. Okay, so I promised you the world, and here it is. I'm going to talk about 5 systems. These are the major upwelling systems of the world, eastern boundary current systems. The yellow arrows indicate primary currents and wind directions, and the red boxes are the study areas that we looked at. We split up the Iberian Canary system into 2 for the purposes of this study, for reasons having to do with atmospheric pressure fields. So Andrew Bakken proposed this upwelling hypothesis in 1990, that there would be a mechanism for global warming would produce increased winds on the alongshore direction, which would therefore lead to increased upwelling. The mechanism that he proposed is illustrated here, where the increasing temperatures would create differential heating of air over the land versus air over the ocean. This would lead to strengthening of the thermal low over the land mass. That creates stronger pressure gradients between the two, which increases the wind, which increases the upwelling. So there's a lot of controversy about all of this. First of all, are these changes actually going to happen with global warming? And secondly, is this the mechanism by which it happens? The study that I'm here to tell you about today was a meta-analysis that we published this year. A meta-analysis means that we did not test the winds or the upwelling. We looked at other studies that tested those things. So we synthesized results from 22 studies that were published between 1990 and 2013, I believe, with data from 1950 to 2010, and that was 198 wind trends that we analyzed. So again, we're looking at winds, and we're using winds to say something about upwelling. Our hypothesis was that the results would be consistent with Bakken's hypothesis, meaning that there would be intensification of upwelling favorable winds given global warming. We scored wind trends from everybody else's studies as consistent or inconsistent with the Bakken hypothesis, meaning that if the results were consistent with the hypothesis, then that would lead to an increase in winds, whereas inconsistent with the hypothesis means that they found a decrease in winds. There was lots of variation in these data sets. We needed to obviously look at these based on the system. So I showed you the picture of the globe. We looked at seasonal data, and I put season in quotes because the question was, were the data sets annual data sets, or were the data sets just from the warm season? And I want to point out that I would be saying warm in summer because some of those are in the southern hemisphere. Data type is also a good question. So you can go out and measure winds. Winds are measured all the time on buoys, for example, or you can have modeled reanalysis, modeled wind data sets. So it's a modeled data set based on observational data. And then there was another question about the latitude of observation. So I'm sure you noticed that those boundary current systems spanned at least a dozen or 2 degrees of latitude. Okay, this is a lovely picture I'm going to start with. We're not going to spend much time on this picture, but what it shows is a generalized warm season climatology, spatial climatology. And we've got colors indicate pressure, and the arrows indicate winds. That's all I need to say about that. It's just pretty. Up here are the real results. And so I'm going to go through in detail for California, and then I'm just going to tell you the answers about the rest of them. At the top with the numbers are the number of studies, or the number of wind trends. We've got the blue line indicates the null hypothesis, and so that means that if we've got bars with a confidence interval above the line, we can say that that showed increasing winds. And when it's below the line, we can say it shows decreasing winds. The color of the bars indicate both the season. So we've got red is warm season, yellow is the annual data, and then green and purple indicate observational or modeled data, and I've got the legend is down here in the corner. And so in California, we can see we've got 3 bars that are high above that line, so we're going to say that this is consistent with the Bakken hypothesis, and upwelling favorable winds are increasing. In the Humboldt system, on here, again, we've got bars above the line, so increasing winds. The Canary system is there. And what I want to point out here is we've got 1 bar way high above, but 1 bar below, and this is for the data type. So we can say that that's equivocal because we can't say in one way or the other. In the Iberian system, we've got 2 bars well below, decreasing winds, inconsistent with the Bakken hypothesis. And in the Benguela system, we only had modeled data from that system, from everybody else's studies, and so they showed increasing winds. So here we've got 1, 2, 3 out of 5 showing increasing winds. To conclude, upwelling is crucial for productive marine ecosystem, and as you all know, we use those marine ecosystems in lots of delicious ways. Upwelling favorable winds are increasing, and this is dependent on system, so where in the world, and data type. I didn't show you these results. I'm just going to tell you, you'll have to believe me or read the paper, that more wind intensification happens at higher latitudes within those systems. And I want to point out that the strongest results that we had, that first graph that I showed you, is for the California current, and that's where we have the most data. So obviously, there's only been 22 studies analyzed. It's only been 20 years. We could really benefit from a lot more data, more time to answer this question better. So I'll stop there. I can have questions.
All right, any questions?
This question might reflect more confusion than you have time to explain, but I'm confused about the idea being that it's land heating that would, and the greatest gradient between ocean and land temperature with the idea that it's actually offshore winds that drive upwelling, and it's in spring, not summer, that you see the upwelling. It's really this transition period between winter and summer that you're really seeing this gradient. So it's not clear to me why summer season would be, first of all, the one you would look at, or what you would expect to be driving it.
Maybe because that's the hottest time of the year.
But that's not
your
when we
question?
see the upwelling. Or
Yeah,
the intense
okay.
upwelling.
You're right. So the upwelling is happening more in the spring and then going through the summer. There's also, I didn't mention this, there's also a little bit of upwelling that happens in the winter. So there's other processes that go into it. I simplified it a lot. I guess I don't know the answer about why the peak upwelling wouldn't happen with the peak heat of the land. But it may have to do with the rate of change. And I do know that it is, the winds come from the difference in the pressure gradient, so there's a little bit of a question about what's happening with the pressure system over the ocean too. Unfortunately, I don't know the details about that, but that's probably along those lines.
And one other follow-up question is just the issue between the intensity versus duration of upwelling, and
The intensity and what? I'm sorry.
intensity and how intense the upwelling is, but possibly for a short time, and the onset of it. Those factors are incredibly important.
They're very important. So the onset of the upwelling season, spring transition, people call that the spring transition time. The timing of that is a huge effect on biological systems for sure. And that is also a question about if that's going to be changing. So will the peak upwelling season happen earlier or later in the year? We don't have answers for that right now, but there are people looking at it. There's a question over there.
Thanks. As you pointed out, not all upwelling is, as you say, delicious upwelling. And I was wondering if your group had any plans to investigate that aspect a little further.
The aspect of?
The strength of the upwelling relative to the kinds of biological productivity that are, useful, I guess?
No, at this point we're not doing that. The strength of the upwelling is a really big question. Like I said, the spatial variation, there's intermittent upwelling where there's relaxation periods and intensification periods that happens in Central California. It's different up here. It's different in Southern California where it's more upwelling all the time. And those certainly have implications for the biological systems. So there's a lot of detail. Yeah, so what I was referring to is more, and to differentiate from what Cliff was talking about yesterday, is that these are sustained winds. So it's windy for 2 weeks when you go out to the coast, for example. And that it doesn't have to be strong winds per se, but it does have to be like active winds, different than like a ferocious storm. I do not. I'm sorry. Yeah, sure. And I simplified that too. We had the a significant latitudinal effect in 3 of the 5 systems. And in the Humboldt system, we had more intensification in the southern Humboldt rather than the northern. So that one supported it really well, but it wasn't greatly supported in a couple of other systems, particularly the Iberian, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I'm agreeing with you. There's lots of variability here, and I decided I was going to try and plot the upwelling for, I think, 48 before I prepared this talk, and it didn't work out. I did that, so of course it depends. It depends on how you look at it sometimes.